So there's a couple of points there that the former Chief Justice makes that I kind of want to get your thoughts on. Okay? First one is his assertion that judges don't have agendas. So you're laughing. You're skeptical. Okay. He's I think there's a tendency on the part of judges, justices to romanticize their own role. I think I'm probably with you. I'm skeptical that, particularly in today's political climate, that there aren't at least some judicial candidates out there that have agendas. So that's number one. I just kind of wanted to see what your reaction to that was. The more important thing, though, was his suggestion about how voters ought to operate. Any thoughts there? Did you notice? Maybe I'm reading too much into his words and his body language, but he seemed to me to go through some pains to avoid using the word political parties. He talked about how it's a challenge for voters. Like there's in Texas, we elect a lot of judges. And it's really hard for voters you're going to be very busy as a voter if you're going to do all the research to try to understand what this candidate's qualifications are versus this candidate versus this candidate versus this candidate for all those judicial posts, right? So he seems to concede. In fact, he uses the word cues. That's the kind of word that a political scientist would use, that voters vote on cues. And he uses the word cues. But what kinds of cues does he suggest? It was just about 3 minutes ago. That's not long. What kind of cues does he suggest?
That you take because you trust the police.
Because you trust what?
The police or the.
Oh, like what? I don't remember him mentioning the police, but he might have agree. He might agree with that. Like so.
I think he mentioned the Texas health, the Texas Health Department.
Oh well, I remember he mentioned the Texas Medical Association. Right. He mentioned contractors. Right? Like contractors, they have a professional association, but what was he suggesting that voters what? Why would you look to the Texas Medical Association, or why would you look to the realtors, the Association of Realtors, or the Association of Contractors, or the Association of Fraternal Order of Police, or whatever they're called, right? Like he's saying you should vote on, like the easiest thing, maybe the best thing for voters to do is to look for certain cues. He uses that word, cues. And the truth of the matter is, I think that's an honest answer, because the truth is we all vote on cues. Even people who follow politics very closely vote on cues. Because, with this very long ballot, particularly in a state like Texas, it is next to impossible to know everything you need to know about the individuals who are running for office. So he's saying, like, if you think of yourself as an environmentalist, let's say, maybe you look to the Sierra Club or the National Audubon Society or something like that and see who they endorse. Right? Or maybe if you are a realtor and you're concerned about real estate law in Texas or something like that, maybe you look to see who the Texas or who the Texas Realtors Association endorses. Or if you are, all about religious morality or something like that, maybe you look to see who the Southern Baptist Convention endorses, right? Or maybe the editors of the Houston Chronicle or the Dallas Morning News or something like that. So he's conceding that we all vote on cues because it's next to impossible to really have the detailed knowledge that would be required to be a really, good civic-minded voter voting for individuals for office. But I find it interesting that he steers completely clear of suggesting that people ought to vote on a party cue. And I wonder why that is. Do you have any thoughts why somebody like the former Chief Justice might, maybe I'm reading more into his words and his body language than I should be, but it just strikes me as odd that he seems so determined to avoid saying that, well, if you're a Republican, vote for Republican candidates. Or if you think of yourself as a Democrat, vote for Democratic candidates. What's wrong with that? Well, again, it goes back to the point that we were making earlier, that there seems to be this widespread perception that that is a basis for casting a vote that's not very thoughtful, right? That the last thing that we want people to do is vote for candidates for judicial office based on their party affiliation. But I'm not sure I'm with that. I'm not here to advance any particular argument, but I at least would like for you as students to give some thought to give some thought and have some reflection on the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is don't cast the vote based on the party, right? But all I'm suggesting to you is that the party is just another cue, right? And there's some argument to be made that maybe it's a more sensible cue than some of these others, even that he's suggesting. Any thoughts about that? Anything? Again, I could be wrong-headed about that, but it just seems strange to me that he's willing to concede that voters need cues, but he seems so intent on avoiding the most obvious cue, which is voting on the basis of party.
So your question is why shouldn't the party be included?
I'm wondering why people think that that is a wrong approach to voting. Why do people think that, at least when it comes to judicial elections, but I think it's also true with mayoral elections and city council elections and school district elections, why do people seem to believe, if we could do a survey and we were to ask, assuming we could construct the wording of this question well, so that it wouldn't be leading or something like that, but essentially what we're trying to get at, we ask 1,000 Texans, is it a good idea for voters to vote for candidates for the school board based on their party affiliation? I suspect that the answer would come back overwhelmingly, no, we shouldn't be basing it on party affiliation. And I think it's very much probably the same thing when it comes to judicial elections. Should voters be voting on the basis of the party affiliation of the judge? I think the overwhelming answer would be no, they shouldn't be. But why? I'm just wondering why there's so much resistance to that when even people who are in the know, like former Chief Justice Tom Phillips, concedes the point that voters have to have cues. There has to be some, you understand what he means by a cue, right? Like just something to kind of give you an indication of who's supporting this person and what that might mean. Like, for example, if you know that the Audubon Society, the National Audubon or the Texas Audubon Society is opposed to this particular judge, your brain goes, if you think of yourself as an environmentalist, your brain goes click, 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 click. Oh, this person must have a bad record on environmental issues, on cases that come before him or her that involve environmental questions. Or if you are a medical doctor, remember that was one of the groups that the program from Tuesday focused on, right? The Texas Medical Association. If the Texas Medical Association endorses a slate of candidates, judicial candidates, your brain goes, and by the way, you are a medical doctor or somebody in your family is a medical doctor, your brain goes click, click, click. Oh, this must be a judge who's gonna make it very difficult for litigants to recover damages from doctors for malpractice. That's what he's saying. Right? He's saying people should vote on cues.
I think the cues he mentions, they aren't just broad political parties. They're more like an agency. So if the Sierra Club endorses a judge or a candidate for the judicial seat, you'll know that judge probably is more environmentally concerned for
So let me ask you this. I think you're right about that, okay? But let me ask you this. If the Southern Baptist Convention endorses a candidate for the Texas Supreme Court and voters go click, 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 oh, that must mean that when it comes to questions like gay marriage, or transgender issues, like, what are some of the issues that have been dealt with, like sports, having transgender individuals play sports of their birth gender or whatever, however that question's framed. Then if the Southern Baptist Convention endorses this particular, I can rest pretty comfortably that this judge, when that case comes before that judge, they're going to decide it in a conservative, sort of the way that I would want them to decide, because that's, after all, why would the Southern Baptist Convention endorse them? Right? But why is that better in the minds of people like Tom Phillips than saying, well, he's a Republican? Because we can say the same thing about, if we know this judge is a Republican, and we know that in the Republican Party platform, there is opposition to having transgender individuals play sports in public schools that are not of their birth gender. You know what the issue I'm talking about, right? It's been a pretty big issue here in the last several years, right? Why is it different if you're voting on that cue because that's the Republican Party?
Because the party concept is too broad for the basic Texan, and if you specify it with these individuals, the Southern Baptists, and these local individuals, their views are more precise, and
But isn't a justice who is elected to the Texas Supreme Court going to deal with a broad range of issues? They're not going to just deal with one particular type of issue. I'm not disputing. I think maybe you're right. I think maybe that is the thinking. Again, I'm just trying to get you. Part of my job is to get you all to reflect and think about and sort of question the conventional wisdom. And I think this is one area where I've been perplexed for many, many years as to why, whether we're talking about judicial elections or whether we're talking about mayoral elections or city council, why there seems to be this overwhelming conventional wisdom. And we see it reflected in the way that, for example, in some states where they have nonpartisan elections for judges, or even here in Texas where we have nonpartisan elections for mayors and city councilors. We know that Sylvester Turner's a Democrat, but for some reason we think it's not appropriate to put that on the ballot for a cue for voters. I just find that kind of fascinating. Okay, you have any thoughts, any questions, anything?
Would you like to give us the answer to that question?
I don't have the answer to the question.
There is a certain one answer to it, because there can just be a lot of different thoughts. And it's a good topic for discussion.
Reflect on it, think about it. If you come up with something, I want to hear your thoughts or your ideas. Sometimes I put you on the spot. I put a class on the spot, and I don't mean to suggest to you that this is the only opportunity for you to think about and reflect on that question. Think about it, come back next Thursday, and if something occurs to you, we'll hear it. Yeah.
I think the cues that the justice talked about probably were better to look at, because if you support one agency and they endorse a candidate, but another agency you also support opposes that candidate, you could try to work out what judges most.
So then it becomes not a matter of partisan politics, it becomes a matter of interest group politics.
Right.
So we're more comfortable with it being interest group politics than partisan politics. We're out of time. Okay, we're out of time. We will call it an afternoon and see you next